Okay, good. All right, so what we're going to get into now is animation inside of C4D with no keyframes. And specifically, we're going to be talking about Mograph and effectors. Now, this is one of the sort of highlight points for using Cinema 4D compared to a lot of other 3D applications. It has a powerful function feature called Mograph that uses effectors in order to create dynamic animations that are a lot more complex than what you might normally be able to do with just sort of your traditional sort of animating techniques. So down here I have a couple different examples of some. I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to play this example video just because it shows a lot of capabilities of what Cinema 4D can do specifically. This was from last year when they came out with a later version of Cinema 4D. So I'm going to pause my background music for a second here. And I'm just going to maximize. Now, if you want to watch this on your own screen, of course, just check out the Blackboard or the Miro board for the actual link here, and you can view this video later on as well. But just going to activate this video. It's about a couple minutes or long or so. I forgot how long this one is, but we'll just check it out here. So that's sort of the intro to the Maxon when they did their whole sort of rebranding thing here. And it looks pretty detailed animation, but there are a lot of different ways and techniques that you can create this sort of effect inside of Cinema 4D without sort of going over and going kind of crazy animating each individual piece on its own, which we'll be getting into. Over here, I also have some other examples of where I've used this sort of in techniques. So over here, this is a project I did for a medical animation, and these are just some stills that I pulled from it, and it was using a puzzle to sort of render out sort of the different text elements and iconography that they wanted throughout the whole sort of piece. It was about a 3-minute animation that they had me make, and here you can see that it's composed of a bunch of different puzzle pieces, and animating these individually would have been quite a task to do, even using some more copy paste sort of methods. So being able to use Mograph and effectors, you're able to create animations like this pretty well, and this is one that I've shown from the beginning of class. So you're probably already familiar with this, but this one I also used some techniques using Mograph and effectors in order to streamline the animation. Some of it is more hand done for a specific effect, but a lot of it is using some of the techniques that we will discuss. So obviously there's a lot of cubes, a lot of boxes. That would be quite a bit to do it on its own directly. So what we're going to get into now for today is we're going to be looking at this project file that I have created here. So in the chat, so that everyone can get started on actually getting this down, I have a link on Dropbox, and I have a link on Mediafire where you can download this scene file. Hopefully both of those options will work for everyone, since I know sometimes Dropbox can be a bit sort of finicky, but this is what we will be looking at and exploring today. So this is a animation that I made in C4D to sort of represent some things that interest me and some things that sort of, appeal to my personal tastes. And what we're going to be doing for this class today is I'm going to be asking everyone to sort of take it upon themselves to sort of tweak my scene file towards their own personal taste. So you'll be able to sort of import your own models, change the text, maybe change the font, maybe change the look of it completely, in order to make it a little bit more unique to yourself. So your sort of own interests that you have. But before we get into doing all of that specifically, I'm actually going to break down this actual scene file so you can see how I actually created it and some of the different sort of techniques that I used without creating any keyframes and actually animate this, because you can see that pretty much everything in this little gift here is moving except for the X, Y, and Z in the back. That isn't animating, although I do have a way of animating that. I just didn't enable it. But everything in here is sort of procedurally sort of animated, which is one of the great benefits of using Cinema 4D or the techniques that we're going to be discussing today. So hopefully everyone has able to download that file, although you can just watch me if you don't want to follow along one-to-one, since I know that can be a bit sort of hard to do in real time. So I'm going to open up my Cinema 4D and I'm going to navigate to where I have the scene file. So I have it as class start file 01. So hopefully this should be the file that everyone has access to and you can open up inside of your version of Cinema 4D. So you can either just double tap it if you only have one version of Cinema 4D, or you could do like me and just drag it into the viewport. And this should work on any version of Cinema 4D from version 20 and above, I believe. So if some of you have a different version like a R25 or anything like that, this should work for you as well. There shouldn't be anything in here that is unique to R24 at least. So this is how the scene file opens up here. So okay, awesome. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, I know sometimes it can be a bit sort of funny. Oh, the quick start dialog? Good question about that. I believe that's in your preferences. You can actually disable that. That is a good question. I actually haven't done that yet. But I believe it's in your preferences. Oh, no, maybe down here would actually be where you can turn it off. I'm not sure, but if you do find it and it's in the preferences, let us know, because I haven't disabled that on mine yet. But hopefully you can still open up Cinema 4D regardless of the little bit of annoying quick start dialog that they have come up all the time now. But if you open up the scene file and we come down to the bottom here, which is where I'll do a little highlight here, you can hit the play button and you should see that the scene plays out inside of Cinema 4D as a perfect loop. So if you recall, one of the sort of extra things you can do on your assignment that's due next week is to create a perfect loop. And you can actually get some extra credit points for that. It's not required, because sometimes your animation doesn't quite work as a loop, but that's sort of the cool thing that people are doing, or you can do in animation, is that you can create a loop and it sort of elevates your animation a little bit. But what we're gonna do here is I'm going to sort of break down sort of the different techniques that I use in my animation here. So let me bring up my little extra notes here on the side. So we can go with this. Okay, awesome. So as you can see, there are a couple different elements in the scene. We got a pan, we got a laptop, we got some headphones, we got a skateboard, we got the initials for my name, GB, and we have this XYZ band in the background. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is going to be my pan object here. So what I'll do, just to sort of show this, is you can, on any of these items that you select, you can sort of solo them and focus on them alone. So on the side panel here, I've clicked this a couple times, but you can actually click on this, and I'm left clicking and holding on it, and it can actually go to viewport solo or viewport solo hierarchy, which will just sort of solo everything that's below it in its hierarchy. So now I have just the pan in focus, and if I middle click and go to my other view here, which for me is my perspective, if you don't see this as perspective, you can of course go to camera and change it to perspective. Now I can sort of go into the scene and I can pan around without fear of moving my camera in my main scene over here. Although if you've already tried to move around in this scene up here, you might notice that you can't do it, and that's because I used a tag to actually lock my camera so I don't move it by accident, because that's something that I do all the time, unfortunately. So you learn to lock down your cameras. But the main thing that I want to show you in this first element here is that if we go to our pan and our object manager over here on the side, and I'll do a little bit of a zoom here, and I click the plus icon to expand, you can see that I have two elements in here. I have a pan and I have a formula effector. So these effectors are up in your Mograph menu. So Mograph effector, and then over here is formula. And then the other way that you can get to these is going to your cloner icon and then going over here to find your formula effector. So multiple different ways to actually access this. But what you can see here is that this element here allows me to actually control everything within this pan group that I have. So I have this pan null object, which I'm using as a grouping element in order to have my formula affect my pan. Now you might be asking how or what is it doing to affect it, and the way that we can tell that what it's doing is by going into our attributes, and of course we should be familiar with using our coordinates because that's how we've been moving stuff around in our scene. And then if we look at the additional tags or tabs that it has here, there's also effector. So this is literally a sort of namesake of everything that's in this sort of category. And you can see here that it has a couple different options here, and I actually haven't changed any of these from the default value. So if you were to add in an effector straight from the menu, you should see the same exact values. But what I have affected is in my parameters. And in my parameters here, there are a number of different options that I can control in order to move this pan. So right now, you should be able to see that I have rotation checked off. And in the B, which is for banking, of course you can't switch these to the other XYZ if you so choose, but you can see that here in the rotation for B, for banking, I actually have it set to 15 degrees. So this 15 degrees, if I hit play on my scene, is what's actually rotating my pan here. And if I were to adjust any of these other values, you can see that now the pan is moving even more depending on my values here. And this isn't limited to just rotation. You could also turn on scale or position, which is what I've done in some of the other items. So if I were to go to position, you can see that here, now I can move the pan and sort of up and down. I can move it in the Z axis. So I can create a lot of custom animations here. And if you've noticed on the timeline here, there are no keyframes. And if I were to switch my layout to animate, you'll see that there are no keyframes in my whole scene here. So you don't actually even need to be in the animate layout if we're using this sort of technique. It might help you in terms of visualizing the whole timeline, but it's definitely not required in terms of controlling elements. Now, you can set keyframes on these, so if you want to just say, have it start at 15 degrees doing this sort of motion and then sort of go down to 0 and stop, you definitely have that option. But just using a couple sort of parameters here, I'm able to sort of create an animation without actually having to set any keyframes. Now, the key thing towards why this actually works inside of this little grouping that I have here is because of what's in my next tab over. So in the next tab over, I have what's labeled as deformer, and this deformer actually controls what's being animated in my scene or in my grouping. So right now you should notice that my deformation is on object, and if I click this drop down, there's a couple different options here. I have point and polygon, and of course I have off as well, and each of these will give me different control over the object that I have grouped together. So in this instance, I have the pan grouped together with the formula, so anything that's in this pan group will be affected here. So if I go to my formula and I choose a different option, say point, so right now it doesn't look like much has happened, right? But if I were to say increase the Y, you can see that now it's actually affecting the points of geometry that are on my pan. So if you've ever seen any of those sort of crazy, sort of unique, sort of abstract animations on maybe Instagram or on TikTok or anything like that, this is one of the techniques that you can use to sort of create those sort of undulating sort of motions. Sort of formula effector can be really powerful in that regard. And this is only difference that we did right now is we use position to control the different points, and we changed the deformation from object, which would be the full object that's in our group, to points. And you can see that there's even another option right below that called polygons, which affects sort of the actual quads or tris or whatever type of polygon faces that we were modeling with our 3D character in our most recent lesson. This is actually affecting those, so you can actually move the faces of your object in different ways, and this is all by controlling what the actual effector is deforming or its actual deformations. And again, while I'm going through this, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I know sometimes it can be a bit more sort of abstract, which this is almost really is abstract animation in this case. So if anyone needs any extra clarification on anything, please feel free to ask at any time. So this is using the deformer and the deformation in order to manipulate our object in our scene, specifically my pan. So I'm going to undo a couple times here to sort of reset things. How did I isolate the pan? That's a good question. So okay, yeah, and I can go over that too. So the way that I isolated the pan was I actually used the view solo button on the left side of my scene. So having my pan group selected, I left clicked on the solo button on the left side and went to view solo hierarchy. You could also do view solo, and I think that would work too as well because everything is in a group here, but if it wasn't in a group, hierarchy would be the other option to choose. So that's how I actually isolated this. It's still in my scene, nothing else has actually disappeared, and it looks like I actually turned off my, there we go, now it's back to object, so now it's actually back to moving the way I had it before. And for the way that I'm setting this up without the keyframes is, again, I'm using the formula effector, which can be found in the Mograph effector formula, and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of other ones here. Or you can go to our cloner object or our cube with our little circles on it and go to the formula effector over here as well. And then having my elements grouped together, so these are in a null group, which if you recall, you can add those into your scene by coming up here to the top menu and going add null or going to create null. It's the first item up here at the menu, and you can group your items below this in order to use the formula factor to deform your object. And of course there are other options such as point and polygon. And you'll see that as I go through the next elements here, they all use a similar sort of way of controlling them. You can control things more directly than sort of grouping them together. So this is just one of the many ways, but this is just a first example that I want to show here in terms of how to actually animate your items in your scene. So let's check out the next item here. So the next one that we have over here is our laptop. So if I open up the laptop here, you'll see that it has a number of different elements in here. I have the buttons, I have the lid, I have the body, I have the keys, and just to sort of focus on this, I'm going to go to solo hierarchy and give it a second. Oh, I gotta make sure to actually enable it, of course, and turn on hierarchy. So now we see just our laptop in our scene. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about on this one is just sort of the motion of the laptop itself. So you can see that the whole laptop here is moving sort of left to right, and this time, instead of using a formula factor for the whole laptop, I used what's called a vibrate tag inside of Cinema 4D. So if you haven't been looking at some of these, you can right click on your items and you actually have a number of what Cinema 4D calls tags, and these allow you to have different sort of properties, and some of these you might have noticed already applied by default, such as material tags. So most of those have been applied when you apply materials to your objects, but you can also apply these directly as well, and there are a whole bunch of these and they take a while to learn, but the one that we're going to be looking at right now is just in animation tags, which is our first one at the top here. And next to it, a drop down comes for a couple different ones, but we're going to be looking at what's called the vibrate tag. So for those of you who are versed in using After Effects, you might be familiar with something called the wiggle expression, which basically allows you to do pretty much what it sounds, add a wiggle to different elements inside of After Effects. The vibrate tag works in a very, you use it, yeah. So the vibrate tag works in a very similar function, just that you don't actually need to do, wiggle, open brackets, your two numbers, comma in between, and then close brackets. You just have to add it to your item, and using the different parameters that it has, you can control its position, scale, and rotation. So sort of very similar to the formula, just that the formula gives you a little bit more control in some cases. But using this on my original tag here, you can see that I have enabled rotation and I have it set for 5 degrees in the amplitude, which means sort of how strong the effect is going to be affected. And then I have a frequency, which is controlling the amount of time of the effect. So if I were to say put this up to 140, you can see that now my laptop spins a lot more in space. And of course there are other functions here. I can control the XYZ or HPB rotations of my laptop here as well. So this is sort of another quick way that you can add animation into your scene. And let's see if I can reset this real fast. So it's another way to sort of add automated animation onto your elements inside of Cinema 4D, and you can do this for position and for scale as well. So is another sort of technique that you can use towards adding animation. And again, this was accessed by going to right-clicking on our laptop and then going to animation tags, vibrate. Or you could go directly up here to the top of your objects manager menu and go into tag and then go into animation tags and then go into vibrate. So multiple different ways to get to it. You could also do Shift C and type in vibrate, and that could also get you there as well. So a couple different ways to get to it. That's just sort of the ways that I might try to actually get to this option. Now the rest of this laptop here is also being moved by another formula effector. So again, I also use formula effector, and this one you can see that it's also deforming the object, and this one is actually affecting the lid. So my actual lid here, and I can increase this just so you can see the effect of it a little bit more, is being affected by another formula effector. So in this case, because I have a lot of different elements in this laptop group, I isolated just the elements that are on the screen so that I could have those bend on the formula here. And then the other thing to keep in mind for this one is, I mentioned last week about sort of moving your access point or your anchor point. I also made sure to adjust my anchor point so that it's right here at the back hinge of my laptop, so that it actually opens and closes on the right sort of pivot point. So something to keep in mind if you're working with items that have sort of a bend in a different place that might not be sort of the default location, is to keep in mind where the element actually bends. So let me undo here a little bit and unsolo, just so we can get back to see our whole scene here. And we'll move on to the next item here. So the next item that I want to talk about here is the headphones. So obviously headphones listen to music. I have some on right now, of course. It's something that I do a lot of. So in this case here, you can see that I have what might be a newer element to some of you, and this is called a fracture object. And this is one of your Mograph elements that you have to actually use in order to control different things. So if you look at the cloner menu, you can come up here, left click, mouse click on it and hold it, and you can see that there's the fracture object there, or Mograph, and we go down to fracture is also another way that you can access this element. And inside of this fracture element are my over-ear headphones. I believe this model came from Cinema 4D in their asset browser, so that's where I got it from here. Yep, you can see that that's where I got it from here. So in here I have a number of different elements, and these are all the different parts of the headphones. I think I just did a little bit of grouping on these, but the main thing to keep in mind here is that this is using this new effector that I haven't mentioned yet so far, called the plane effector. And I guess towards this namesake here, it does sort of plane effects on the different objects. Now, you might have noticed already that there's no grouping between the plane effector and the fracture over ear headphones. They're in two separate, sort of groups here, or their own groups. They're not linked by any sort of hierarchy or anything like that. So the question is, how does this control the headphones? Because if I play the headphones right now and I were to say adjust the values here, you can see that it's definitely affecting my headphones, but it's not seemingly connected. And the way that it's doing that is because your Mograph objects inside of Cinema 4D have the ability to have effectors added to them directly. So on the fracture item, and this applies to all of the Mograph items, there's a section tab for effectors, and in here just like how we had our formula effector in a group, you can drag and drop your effectors that you have in your scene directly into this window here. And if you actually come up to your menu and actually create a new effector, it actually automatically adds it into it. So if you have it selected, it'll add it to it, but if not, you can just drag it in directly as well. So once you have that in the field there, I'm going to undo a couple times here. Now you can actually go into your effector, whatever effector it is. I'm using a plane effector this time, and you can adjust these values in order to control them in different ways. So you can see here that I can have the headphones go all crazy, and you can do whatever you want with it. So the difference here is, instead of having them grouped together like I had with the pan and the laptop's lid, I used a fracture object. I placed my modeled object, or found item, inside of the fracture object. So hover over it, release it, and now it's inside of it. And then in the fracture object, in the effectors tab, I added my plane effector. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. You can add multiple different effectors in here. You can have ones have more strength than the other ones. You can mix and match. There's a lot of different power that you can have with this sort of flexibility here. And the idea of a fracture object is sort of bringing multiple things together, or it could do the opposite and explode multiple things as well. So you can see here that in the object tab here, it also has the option for straight, explode segments, and connect. So let's see what happens if I choose one of these and hit play. So now if I zoom in and let's say I solo my headphones here, you can see that now, and I'll make it a bit more obvious. Now you can see that the different parts of my headphones actually explode out from each other. So it no longer treats it as one single object, it treats them as separate objects. So if you're ever curious about doing any of those sort of exploding sort of detailed animation where they sort of break down objects and shows individual parts, this might be a cool way to show sort of an object's many different parts that it has. So this is one of those techniques that I'm sure if you watched enough shows, you might have actually seen this done in one form or another. So it can create some pretty cool effects depending on what you're going for, especially if you're trying to do maybe more of a blueprint type of thing where you're trying to sort of show the schematics of something. It's definitely something that's used a lot in those sort of instances. But I'm sure you could think of other creative ways for it to be used as well. So don't limit yourself, of course, to just what you've seen. Definitely, these are things that are worth sort of experimenting with and seeing what you can create on your own that might be unique towards what you're going for. So that is sort of the headphones here. Let's see, the only other thing I have in here that I would like to mention for these ones, let's see, so the one thing that I haven't mentioned for the headphones so far is how does it actually know to move? Because by default, if you just add a plane effector to an object, it doesn't move by default. It just sort of moves it based off of whatever the parameters that you have set here, which is good. That might be what you're going for, but we're looking at animation right now. So what we want to look at is on my plane effector here, there's another tab that we haven't discussed yet called the fall off. And under the fall off here, you have what Cinema 4D calls fields. And this is something that is pretty unique to Cinema 4D for the most part, although other programs have similar versions of this. And this is something that they created a couple years ago, I believe. But this basically allows you to have more control over your animations or over your effectors. You can see in here that I have a time sort of field added into my fall off here, and this time is actually what's animating my scene. So very similar to how the formula effector was using sort of this sort of built-in sort of time function in order to animate. This one I had to add the time in myself, because if I delete this, you'll see that my headphones don't move anymore. So the time is what's actually driving the parameters that I have set over here. And there are a bunch of different fields that you can add. You can see that there's a whole bunch down here that you can add. There's some in solid, and these all do different things. And if you're really interested on sort of getting into the nitty-gritty, any one of these you can sort of come over here and right click, go to show help in order to get more information on the actual field layers and the fields specifically. But what I wanted to show you is that by going into the help here, you can actually see what the actual animation sort of curve actually is. So a lot of this can be kind of abstract in terms of, you know, how is this sort of animation actually moving over time. Like, sure, we can see that it's, you know, being played back and forth, and it seems like it's just sort of like wiggling back and forth. But if we go to the help here, and I went to my shape sign, or just the shape layer control here, and I went to right click, show help, and that brings up the C4D's help menu. It actually gives you a visual representation of what these actual options even are. So before, in one of my quiz questions, I mentioned triangle motion. You can actually see here that triangle motion actually is a thing. It actually is sort of a technique that you can actually use for animation. And if I were to sort of change my animation now from a sine wave to triangle, you can hopefully see, and I'll make it more apparent by sort of increasing the parameters value here. You can see that it now sort of has this sort of hit effect when it gets to the edges instead of a sort of smooth motion, which is what it had before. So in my effector, in my fall off selection, in my layer for the fields here, I have the shape of my actual animation curve. This is similar to what you would see in the animation timeline if you were to do it more manually yourself. This allows you to sort of control your different animation into different modes here. And some of these are more obvious what they do. You can see here, Square does more of a sort of a stop motion effect. So if that's something that you might be interested in, this might be something to sort of take a look at. You got Sawtooth here as well. So I encourage you to sort of play around with these things and sort of see what you can actually make up with these. All right, cool. So let's move on to the next one here. Turn off solo. All right, so next one here I have is a skateboard, and this is also using time as well. So you can see right above here I have a time effector, so very similar to the time that was inside of the plane effector directly in the field. This time I have it on the outside. So this would be found in our effectors time, or in our menu would be Mograph effector time. And I added this into my scene, and just how like before we had our plane effector that was controlling our fracture object, this time our time effector is controlling the fracture object that has a skateboard inside of it. So if I go into my time effector, it can go to my parameters, and I can see that it's affecting the rotation on the p-axis here 120 degrees. And of course I could maybe times this by 2, assuming I could do my math correctly, of course. There we go. So now it's 240 degrees and is spinning a lot faster on this axis. So again, no keyframes, is using the internal timeline, or the time of Cinema 4D, in order to create this animation. And I can, have it move. I can have it move up and down. You can do a lot with this in terms of animation, and this is using the time effector. Again, don't think that you have to like memorize all these right now. It's definitely not going to be quizzed or anything like that one-to-one. I'm just really sort of exposing you to the different tools and techniques that are inside of Cinema 4D in order to create these sort of animations. There are a lot of these, and it's something that if you keep using Cinema 4D, you definitely learn them over time. I definitely did not know all of these when I started, and they do actually add new ones as well. So some of these even I'm not familiar with as much because they've been added later on and I just don't use them as much. So, I encourage anyone to sort of try some other ones that I haven't even mentioned because they might create some interesting results that even I haven't thought of. And again, this is using the fracture object with all of my skateboard parts inside of it. So the skateboard model itself definitely has a lot of different parts to it, but putting it in the fracture object allows it to be read as one singular object, and then I can apply an effector to my actual fracture object as one individual unit. So that is using the time effector in order to manipulate the skateboard here. So we just got one more here, and then I'm going to actually let everyone to have a little bit of a break and to sort of start working on customizing this scene for yourself, because that's what's going to be asked for you in our little in-class assignment part here, and you'll actually use that in our second part of the lesson here as well. So the last item here, before I give everyone a break, is our name in the background here. So this is what I'm going to ask everyone to actually use your own initials for. So hopefully everyone is well versed in using type inside of Cinema 4D. Let me solo this. So this is sort of your standard text object in my scene. You can of course choose any font that you want for your option. So I'm just going to choose a different font right now just to choose a different one. And if I hit play, you can see that right now it's just hovering sort of up and down in an undulating motion, and it's using this formula. So again, I'm using a formula effector in our scene, but what's unique to what we now have text objects inside of Cinema 4D is it also has the ability to add different effectors directly to the type. So on your text object, you might have noticed that there are a couple different extra tabs at the end here called all, line, words, and letters. So these are actually different selection areas where you can actually add effectors to. So right now in the letters option, which means that it's going to affect all the letters individually, I have my formula. So if I go into my formula and I mess with the Y value here, you can see that now it's moving my Y letters up and down even more so in my scene. And of course, if I want to add rotation, I could do rotation to these as well, or any sort of motion that I so choose. And this is all using sort of the formula in order to drive my effector. This can be really sort of powerful, and you can create a lot of sort of fun different looks with this. And this is applied directly to the text object. And right now I have it affecting the letters, but let's say I didn't want it to affect the letters. Maybe I wanted to affect the whole word as one unit. I could turn it off or disable it in the letters, click the words, and I can left click on the formula, hold it, don't let go of it, and drag it to the effects. And now you can see that now my text moves as one full unit here. So again, you can have control over your lines or all. So if you have multiple words together, or if you're doing, say, a full brand's name and you want to create a cool text animation to go with it, you can have it affect the whole thing or just part of it. There's really like endless possibilities that you can do with this. So let me undo here a little bit. Set it back to where I had it. And now we can come back and see our full scene here. So this is sort of the main idea of using Mograph and effectors in order to animate the different elements in your scene without any keyframes. Because again, if we look at our timeline here, there are no keyframes in this scene. You can add keyframes. You can use keyframes with your Mograph effectors, and a lot of people do in order to create, unique and custom looks. But this is just one way to show you the sort of power that you can use inside of Cinema 4D to create animations without sort of, going all crazy with the keyframes. Some people love keyframes and they're really into them, and that's sort of like their bread and butter. But there are, other ways and other techniques in order to create animations. So that's what I wanted to show here. So let's see, what else do I have here? I think that's going to be the main part here, but again, just in case anyone missed a little bit of that, let me switch my layout back to standard here. The main way that we are accessing these tools for adding animations into our scene is in our Mograph menus. So in our menu across the top, that would be underneath Mograph. So right up here at the top is Mograph, and in our effectors are where we are adding our different effectors. So there are many different ones in here. Some of these might be more apparent what they do, some of these might not be apparent what they do. The ones that we've looked at a lot today have been the time and the formula effector, but there are other ones here. We mentioned the plane as well. Some of these create some cool effects that you might notice are very apparent. Some of these you might have to bring in other elements in order to get them to work, such as sound. So for anyone who's really into sound and using that to drive your animation, that is totally something you can do inside of Cinema 4D pretty easily. So yeah, we have a whole bunch of different elements here that we can use, and you can also find these in our top menu here, where our cloner object item is. Left clicking and holding on that will bring you to this whole menu system as well, which are the same thing as the ones that are over there. So multiple different ways to access this. So now that we've gone through this and we've been going for a little bit, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of a break, but I'm going to ask you to modify the scene file that I gave you. So what I'm requesting for you to do is to change the scene in a couple different ways. So I want you to make it sort of unique to you. So I would like you to change the text, change it to your initials or your name, or you could pick a different name if you want. Change the colors, so you can see that there are a bunch of different materials that I have in the scene that have different colors. And then I would say add some new models that represent your interests. I'm sure they're not the exact same as me, but I would say check out the asset browser first. So asset browser first, or content browser, whichever name you prefer. I would say check that one out first. And then I would say for that one, I'm going to ask you to basically just sort of change some settings in the animation. So right now it's set to render out as an animation sequence. So what I'm going to actually ask you to do is to actually render out just one frame. So just one frame, and post it to the Dropbox or the Mediafire link, which I will add into the chat in a second. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do. And I do see that there is a question, so if you would like to go ahead. So okay, yeah, so you might notice that the styling on this, so that's a good question, so thank you for asking that. So yeah, so the styling that I went for this is sort of your sort of flat shade look. So if you remember in some of the other lessons we talked about sort of the text can actually have different sort of selection sets on them. So these texts, depending on which materials that you change, they'll affect either the inside or the outside or the ridges of the text. So if I were to change sort of the ones on the inside, it'll affect different parts than the outside. So if you do apply just a new material on it, you might notice that it might sort of go completely over everything. So if you're looking to create the same sort of similar effect that I have here, you'll have to use the different selection sets, which can also be accessed in your selections on the text. Or, of course, feel free to change the look of the scene overall. You don't actually have to have sort of flat shade textures. You could have maybe make yours more realistic, more 3D realistic. So you could do more sort of reflective and shiny environment. I'm not really sort of limiting you to sort of have yours to look like mine. This is just sort of the styling that I went for mine, mainly to keep the render times down, because I know that sometimes that can be an issue. So that's why I have mine looking more flat shade. But if you want to change up the look, maybe add more shiny materials, please go for it. But that's a good question. Thank you for asking that.